You may have heard the story of Agamemnon, the king who conquered Troy, only to die in his own home. But what if I told you his tragedy didn't begin with him? It began generations earlier, with a family where fathers betrayed sons, brothers murdered brothers, wives killed husbands, and children were born only to continue the cycle of revenge. This family had a name: the House of Atreus, the most cursed family in Greek mythology.
The Story Vault. Unlock the Untold.
Before we begin, if you've watched Dune, the name House Atreides might sound familiar. That's no coincidence. Author Frank Herbert borrowed the name from Greek mythology. The noble House Atreides was inspired by the House of Atreus. But while Dune tells the story of a family destined to rule, the House of Atreus tells the story of a family destined to destroy itself. When people hear the name House of Atreus, they usually think of one person: Agamemnon, the king who led the Greek army against Troy, the man who commanded Achilles and Odysseus, the man who won the greatest war in Greek mythology. But Agamemnon was not where this story began. By the time he was born, the curse had already followed his bloodline for generations. Because the story of the House of Atreus didn't begin with a war. It began with a father, a son, and a crime so terrible that even the gods could not ignore it. His name was Tantalus. Tantalus was not originally remembered as a monster. In fact, according to Greek mythology, he was one of the few humans ever welcomed among the gods. Imagine that. A mortal sitting at the table of Olympus, sharing food and conversation with Zeus himself, a privilege almost no human ever received. But Greek mythology often asks the same question: what happens when a human is given something they were never meant to have? Tantalus slowly began to forget his place. He was no longer satisfied with being honored by the gods. He wanted to prove that he belonged among them, that he was their equal. Different ancient sources tell different versions of what happened next. Some say Tantalus stole the gods' sacred food and gave it to humans. Others say he revealed secrets of Olympus. But the darkest version is the one that became the most famous. According to the myth, Tantalus wanted to test whether the gods truly knew everything. So he committed an unimaginable act. He killed his own son, Pelops, and served him as a meal at a banquet for the gods. The test was not just cruel, it was an act of arrogance. Tantalus was challenging the gods themselves. He believed he could deceive beings who were supposed to know everything. But the gods knew. They immediately recognized what had happened. They restored Pelops back to life, but the crime of Tantalus would not disappear. Because in Greek mythology, some actions do not end with the person who committed them. They become a legacy.
Tantalus received one of the most famous punishments in mythology. For eternity, he stood in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. Whenever he reached for the water, it disappeared. Whenever he reached for the fruit, the branches moved away. He was surrounded by everything he needed, but could never have it. And from this punishment came the word tantalize, something close enough to desire, but forever out of reach. But the true tragedy of Tantalus was not his punishment. It was what he passed down.
because his son Pelops would grow up, start a new generation, and unknowingly continue the cycle that would destroy his descendants. Pelops became a powerful king. He ruled a wealthy kingdom. He gained influence. He built a family. But the shadow of his father's crime never truly disappeared. Because in Greek mythology, a curse is rarely just a punishment. It is a story passed down. Pelops had many children, but two of his sons would become the center of the tragedy: Atreus and Thyestes. At first, they were brothers, members of the same royal family. But as they grew older, something changed, because both wanted the same thing: power. The kingdom, the throne, the right to rule. And once ambition enters a family, even blood relationships can become fragile. The brothers eventually became rivals, and their conflict would create one of the darkest acts of revenge in ancient stories. Atreus became king of Mycenae, but Thyestes wanted that power for himself. Their rivalry became a battle of betrayal. Each brother tried to outsmart the other. Each believed he was the one who had been wronged. And this is where the story becomes difficult, because Greek tragedies often ask a question: who started the violence? The first person who committed the crime, or the person who chose revenge? According to the most famous version of the myth, Atreus discovered that Thyestes had committed an affair with his wife, and instead of simply removing his brother from the kingdom, he planned a revenge so cruel that it would define their family forever. Atreus invited Thyestes to a feast. He pretended that the conflict between them was over. A chance for reconciliation. A chance for two brothers to finally make peace. But it was a trap, because inside that meal was the darkest secret imaginable. Atreus had killed Thyestes' own children and served them to him without him knowing. The horror of the story comes from the moment Thyestes discovered the truth. He had not simply lost a battle. He had lost his children, his family, everything. And according to the myth, he cursed Atreus and his descendants. Not just Atreus himself, but everyone who would come after him. This is the moment the House of Atreus truly became cursed. Because from this point forward, violence was no longer a single act. It became a pattern. A father harms a son. A brother seeks revenge. A child inherits the hatred of the generation before. And the cycle continues. But Greek mythology has a cruel irony. The curse did not destroy the family immediately. Instead, it made them more powerful. The descendants of Atreus would become some of the most famous rulers in Greek mythology, including two brothers who would one day be connected to the greatest war the ancient world had ever imagined: Agamemnon and Menelaus. Yes, the same Agamemnon who would lead the Greek army against Troy was born into this family. The same bloodline that carried kingship also carried generations of revenge. And suddenly, the story we thought we knew begins to look different. The Trojan War wasn't just about Helen. It wasn't just about Achilles. It wasn't just about a city across the sea. It was also the latest chapter of a family tragedy that began long before anyone sailed toward Troy. Most people know Agamemnon as the king who led the Greek armies against Troy. But before he became a legendary king, He was already carrying the weight of his family's history. And then came the moment that would define him forever. The Greek fleet was ready to sail toward Troy. Thousands of soldiers waited. Hundreds of ships stood in the harbor, but the winds refused to blow. The goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon, and the only way to restore the winds was through an impossible sacrifice. His own daughter, Iphigenia. This moment is one of the most important in the entire story of the House of Atreus, because Agamemnon faced the same temptation that had destroyed his ancestors, the belief that the greater goal justified the terrible action. Tantalus believed his desire to challenge the gods mattered more than his own son. Atreus believed revenge mattered more than his brother's children. And now, Agamemnon believed victory mattered more than his daughter. Different versions of the myth tell different endings. Some say Iphigenia was sacrificed. Others say Artemis rescued her at the last moment. But the damage was already done, because Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, would never forgive him. While Agamemnon spent 10 years fighting at Troy, his family waited. The war eventually ended. Troy fell. Agamemnon returned home as a hero. But the curse of his family had followed him all the way back. Clytemnestra welcomed him. But behind that welcome was 10 years of grief and anger. According to Greek tragedy, she killed Agamemnon after his return. The king who conquered Troy was destroyed by the consequences of his own choices. But this is where the story of the House of Atreus becomes even more complicated, because revenge did not end with Agamemnon's death. It simply moved to the next generation. Agamemnon and Clytemnestra had children. Among them was a son named Orestes. Orestes was trapped between two impossible choices. His father had been murdered, but the person responsible was his own mother. In the world of ancient Greece, family duty was sacred. A son was expected to honor his father. But killing your own mother was one of the greatest crimes imaginable. Orestes stood between two terrible choices. If he did nothing, he betrayed his father. If he took revenge, he would commit an unforgivable act. And once again, the House of Atreus repeated the same question. How far can revenge go before the person seeking justice becomes the next criminal? According to Greek mythology, Orestes eventually chose revenge. He killed Clytemnestra. But unlike previous generations, his story did not end there. Because the ancient Greeks introduced something new, a force that had never truly existed in this family's story before. Not revenge, not punishment, but the possibility of justice. For generations, the House of Atreus lived by one rule. A wrong must be answered. A murder must be punished. A betrayal must be repaid. Every generation believed they were the one who would finally restore justice. But every act of revenge created another crime. And every crime created another reason for revenge. The family was not destroyed by one person. It was destroyed by a cycle. And now, that cycle rested on the shoulders of one man, Orestes. After killing his mother Clytemnestra, Orestes did not feel like a hero. He was haunted. Because even though he had avenged his father, he had also committed one of the most forbidden acts in the ancient Greek world. He had killed his own mother. The Furies came after him.
ancient spirits who punished crimes against family. They chased him. They tormented him. They reminded him that revenge did not erase what he had done. And this is what makes Orestes different from everyone before him. His ancestors acted out of anger, out of pride, out of a desire to make someone else suffer. But Orestes was forced to face the question they avoided. Was revenge actually justice?
Eventually, Orestes sought help from the gods. His case was brought before Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy. And for the first time in the history of this cursed family, the answer would not be decided by another act of violence. It would be decided by a trial. This moment is considered one of the most important stories in Greek mythology because symbolically, something changes. For generations, the House of Atreus lived under the law of revenge. Blood demanded blood. But now, a new idea appeared: justice. The court listened to both sides. The Furies argued that Orestes had murdered his own mother. And they were right. The crime could not simply be ignored. Apollo defended Orestes, arguing that he had acted to avenge his father's murder. And the gods themselves had to confront a difficult question. When someone commits a terrible act, but does it because of another terrible act, where does the responsibility end? According to the myth, Athena and the judges eventually decided to spare Orestes. The curse was finally broken. But the ending is not simply about Orestes being forgiven. It is about something much bigger. A civilization moving away from endless revenge and toward a system where conflicts could be judged. The Greeks used this story to explain something fundamental. A society cannot survive if every person takes justice into their own hands. Because when everyone becomes the judge, everyone eventually becomes the criminal. And that is why the House of Atreus remains one of the most powerful stories in Greek mythology. It begins with a man who challenged the gods. It continues with brothers destroying each other. It reaches Agamemnon, the king who won the greatest war of his age. And it ends with a son who finally chooses not to continue the same pattern. For generations, this family inherited pain. They inherited betrayal. They inherited revenge. But finally, someone inherited the chance to stop it. Perhaps the true curse of the House of Atreus was never a punishment from the gods. Perhaps the real curse was believing that violence could fix violence. And maybe that is why this ancient myth still matters. Because thousands of years later, families still carry old wounds. People still inherit anger they did not create. And the hardest thing to do is often the simplest: to be the person who ends the cycle.
The Story Vault. Unlock the Untold.